Hi guys, we are Design Eyeo.
I'm Nick Hardeman. I'm the Minister of Interactive Art.
He came up with that title himself. I'm Theo Watson. I'm a co-founder of Design Eyeo, and as Dave mentioned, Emily is the other co-founder, and she's very, very sad she can't be here. This is because of this little bundle of cuteness, Eyeo. She was not feeling super well, so they were both meant to come. Sadly, they are not there. We have a small studio based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. We really enjoy making interactive installations, experimental data visualizations, and new forms of storytelling. We've shown our work at Eyeo several times before, and actually haven't been back for a while because we've just been working on one big project for the last 2 years. This project is Connected Worlds, and it's an interactive installation that we've been developing for the New York Hall of Science in Queens. I should just say huge thanks to the sponsors of the project, the National Science Foundation, Google, and the JPB Foundation. And a huge, huge thanks to Jer, who essentially connected us with the New York Hall of Science, and without him, this project would not exist today. So thank you, Jer. He was talking with them about the space that they have called the Great Hall, and you can actually see how huge this space is. That's the height of a person in the space. And they wanted to develop an interactive installation for the space. Jer showed them our project Funky Forest, where you can make trees with your body and then route water flowing across the floor to the trees to keep them alive. And NICEYE was really excited about this, so we went in and we kind of showed them Funky Forest. And we kind of happened to mention that we'd always wanted to make something like Funky Forest, but 10 times the size, where there are multiple kind of interactive worlds that were connected together. And they said, let's do this, to our surprise. And so we knew we would need a little bit of help in addition to the three of us. So we brought on this amazing illustrator called Joshua Goodridge and really great game designer, Zach Gage, to help us with the project. So before we really started work, we kind of worked on what the concept was. And immediately, one of the things we knew we wanted to do was have a giant waterfall flowing down the wall, and with water kind of going from the wall across the floor, and then letting kind of children be able to kind of route water to these different environments. This was some early development of the different habitats that we were imagining for connected worlds. And NICEYE was really excited about this approach because they really wanted to find a way to kind of frame sustainability from a systems thinking perspective, where children manage a single resource, as in water, and they can make decisions about what they do with that resource. So they can choose kind of where to route it and then sort of have to deal with the consequences of their actions. And so because of this, we got really excited about playing with this idea of too much and too little, where systems could be flooded or they could be droughts. And so these were some early sketches during the concept phase, sort of showing what might happen if they kind of release too much water from the environments. Kind of central to this whole thing was the idea that we really needed to have a fixed amount of water. We couldn't just create water and destroy water. We wanted the system to essentially have one amount of water, and it was about transferring this resource around the environment.
Since there was a finite amount of water, we thought it was really important to have the water always visible. So in each scene, there's a water table, as you can see on the bottom. We'll show you how much water is in each of the scenes. And when water is leaving the scene, you can see it being transferred up into the clouds, and those clouds go on over into and deposit it into the waterfall.
And so we really like this idea that children could look around and visually sort of add up all the water they see, whether it's as in the water table or in the clouds, and kind of come back to that 1.0 of water. We didn't want anything to be hidden from them. So the next kind of phase was to do some early design. We have a wall filled with these sort of kind of posters of kind of visual references, as well as sketches of sketching out how the environments might look. This is some early plant design.
These are some early wetlands plant designs that are sketches that start off a little bit looser and they become a little bit more refined. There's a few creatures in there as well.
And Nick's favorite creature, which is the toad in the bottom left-hand corner. He was literally begging us to add the toad into Connected Worlds.
And actually, none of these shown here made it into the final.
There's like an island of misfit plants that is like the majority of the plants that never made it into the project. But it was really fun kind of developing these ridiculous kind of like logic to the plants, like this water hose plant that squirts water everywhere. And then this is sort of us putting them all into one scene to see how it might look. It's very kind of surreal looking. Then sort of stripping that down a little bit to kind of make it a bit more manageable, and so that Nick and I could start implementing this stuff in code. So the next kind of phase for us was to start kind of doing small-scale tests in our office.
And we set up a small-scale installation because we didn't have the space to see two environments side by side. So we used some foam core and one projector to set up an early prototype of the desert scene on the left and the jungle on the right.
And it was really great for us to see, even though the floor looked terrible with these just water particles, simulating the water, it was just really helpful for us to see this, at this scale and kind of it really motivated us to kind of take it to the next level, which, was actually then kind of testing it at a larger scale, closer to what the final installation would be like. For Emily, a big part of this is sort of testing graphics on the projection. A lot of stuff that looks really good on your computer screen, when you test project it, like you don't see the details or things that, that you didn't notice on your screen, you really notice when it's sort of blown up huge. So she goes through this process of sort of testing kind of graphics and kind of taking notes to then kind of develop changes later.
And here we're running the application for the desert, and we're testing some of the plant graphics and making them programmatically. And we also tested some of the interaction as well. And
interaction testing often involves getting on your knees and trying to make your body the size of a 5-year-old's body to see how that feels, both from a kind of interaction perspective but also a scale perspective. What was really nice about this process, this very long 2-year process of developing this project, was that NICE scheduled regular prototypes at the Hall of Science. And that meant bringing children in to kind of test some of the stuff that was being developed. Here you can see we've implemented some of the desert plants into the desert scene and developed some of the characters, like this really funny little bird that drinks water and then gets really fat and flies off slowly.
This is a prototype we built for pumping water. It's a modified bike pump that's hooked up to a flow meter that wirelessly requests water using XB.
And so we brought the pumps in to see how that felt kind of for children as an interface. And it was almost too successful because the children would basically constantly pump water from the central reservoir. Even if no one needed it, they would just be furiously pumping. And then this kid in the middle here is praying because finally there's some rain that has allowed them then to pump all the water out again. So. We also got to see some different environments like the jungle, early jungle prototype, the reservoir, and the wetlands. And again here, the kids immediately pumped the reservoir down to no water. So that was kind of a pretty valuable lesson for us.
We also tested fading the background images to show where the water was. So on the edges, you can see it's sort of brown. There's no water there. If you look at the water table in the bottom, you can see there's some water there, so it's green towards the center.
And then we were experimenting with ways that children could plant seeds. The first version of kind of the seed interface, which allowed you to select and plant a seed in the ground, was kind of very interface looking. And so we tried to kind of move away from anything that felt like an interface and make the seeds feel a little bit more organic, while still being able to actually see what it is you're planting. Here's some video from the early prototype. You can see the kids kind of playing across the 3 environments. You can also see we got the kind of the network together, and we had clouds migrating from the wetlands and jungle into the reservoir. You can also see here a girl chopping down dead trees with the chop gesture, and then clearing some space and then planting a seed, planting some more trees. So we really enjoyed doing these prototypes, but we had a couple of realizations from this. One, we felt that the plants were fairly static and they weren't really that responsive. And we wanted to find ways going forward where we could make the plants feel more programmatic and dynamic. And the other was that we found that with the fact that you could create these huge trees very quickly, we felt that that actually meant that children weren't so invested in the health of these environments. So we wanted to find a way to solve that.
So we came up with a plant level system in which children start off by planting much smaller plants, and they move up to the larger level 4 plants. And the larger plants drink more water, so they're harder to achieve, and they're also harder to maintain. But if you plant a level 4 plant, they attract the more rare creatures.
And here are some early kind of level 1 plant sketches. And here are some for the desert as well. You can see some level 1 and 2 plants here that have a much more programmatic approach.
And here's a sketch for the shifty cactus over on the left. It's the pink and the green one. And this structure is made entirely programmatically, and this allowed us to move it and shift it around in the final version here.
We also wanted to add some dynamic plants to the reservoir, and we really like this idea of the hairy plant that would respond to the level of water in the reservoir. So if the reservoir was full, his hair would be all above his head, but as the water levels went down, it would all come down and he would get mopey.
So we wanted a way to control dynamic elements, and we came up with this SVG system, and as you can see from Emily's sketch here, it was sort of a love and hate relationship.
It got exceedingly more complex the further we went.
So we came up with this idea of using lines, and we can take the lines that are going along the riverbed here and know where the water should be flowing, and also these flood lines towards the right and the left to know when the river overflows, the water should extend out to these lines. There's also these yellow lines here at the bottom called the creature lines, and they walk along those lines, as you can see here, and they dip down into the riverbed, and it feels like they're responding to the terrain.
We also try to bring more dynamic elements into the environments, like grass that was done programmatically that would allow the grazers to eat the grass, but then also when the riverbed flooded, you would see the kind of grass kind of recede in response to the flooding.
So Emily wanted a way to control these dynamic elements, and so she was able to place an image in this SVG file, and then a way to control these dynamic...
I mean, what was crazy about this system is it started off very simple,
Yes.
and then Nick ended up making the system where you could program the elements from the layer names in Illustrator, and with even like parameters passed through in parentheses at the end. So I feel like he took like SVG to this kind of crazy, crazy level.
So for example, you can pass in the waviness, and you'll see in the bottom left these elements are moving, and you can pass in the amount of waviness. And also when you add water, these moss things that were laid out in the SVG editor will grow.
It was really helpful for us because we were constantly changing the environments. And so being able to sort of change these parameters or change where things were growing in an SVG file was actually a very kind of intuitive way to do it. Here you can see some of the level 1 and level 2 plants for the jungle. And we really wanted the plants to be a lot more responsive since the prototype. And the way that we did that was this kind of awesome system that might be my favorite bit of code in the whole project.
Theo wrote this code, if you can't tell.
It's basically the most awesome code. All right, so wait for it. It's called the flex shape. And what we do is we basically run OpenCV over the alpha channel of any PNG file that we want to kind of animate. And then from that alpha channel, we get a contour that's just the outline of the visible image. And then the really hard part, which doesn't sound hard, is we get the left side and the right side as 2 separate lines. And then we build a mesh from those 2 sides and bring the texture back in. And having that mesh allows us then to kind of make the plant bend programmatically. We can even kind of make it kind of be a kind of hanging plant like this. And it also lets us kind of have creatures respond to the contour of the plants. So these little guys are kind of crawling up and down the stalks, and they can kind of react to the wide parts of it. They can, essentially look like they're crawling on the stalks directly. So this is the flex shape. It's my favorite bit of code, I think. And then this is a ton of flex shapes, just testing them with the glow in the planes. This is what happens when you don't initialize your variables. I think I left the angle variable uninitialized, and you can see that things are kind of quickly spiraling out of control. We didn't want to run it for that long because it was kind of terrifying.
This is an early experiment playing with a little more programmatic elements moving along the plants.
And when Emily and I saw this, I think I almost punched Nick in the arm. We were so excited just to see stuff that was much more dynamic and programmatic.
So in the final version, it's a combination of the flex shape and the programmatic elements that we made in the previous experiment. And these little guys are called the grassmen, and they're a strange hybrid between a creature and a plant. And they like to stay together in these clumps or groups, and they hide behind a healthy plant. So you can see the plants over there are dying, and they're all moving towards this healthy plant in the center. And they're very fun because they'll look at you and follow you. And once there's no plants to hide behind, they all scurry off and they exit the wetlands.
And sometimes you'll see them like about to leave the screen, and a kid will plant a seed, and they'll all like return and come back, and it's like really satisfying to keep them in the environment. A big part of connected worlds was going to be the floor and having this kind of dynamic water system that children could control. For Funky Forest in the past, we had a fairly simple approach, which was using a bunch of particles and a vector field to have the water flow from left to right across the floor. And this worked for the Funky Forest space, which was a much smaller space. But we knew that for connected worlds, because it was 68 feet of floor space that children would be interacting in, we wanted to develop a system where water would sort of continue on in whatever direction children guided it. And that meant that you could even like kind of bend water to go completely in 180 degrees and get these kind of really complex feedback loops where the water would actually interfere with itself. And once we started playing with these early versions of it, we got really excited because it adds a lot of complexity. And I think from the children's perspective, it kind of adds a nice challenge to the water routing part of it. So, creatures were always going to be a big part of connected worlds, and we had this idea that, some creatures would be indicators, or or some creatures would be interferers, but mainly that creatures would essentially kind of be an indicator of how successful your environment was in sustaining life. And because we were doing work with NYU and collaborating with NYU's Games for Learning Institute, they actually did a whole bunch of research based on some early creature designs where they interviewed a whole ton of kids and asked them what they thought about all these different creatures. And we've never done this before. We usually just come up with crazy creatures and just like have the children deal with it. So it was really strange to get like a spreadsheet back with all this feedback. And I almost didn't want to read it at first. And then it was really kind of funny because we learned something really valuable, which was this character, the pointy bird, was we were told that was the most popular character that the children looked at. And we looked at the feedback, and it was kind of fairly minimal. They didn't say that much. And then there was this other character that we were told was the least popular character, and they found it quite confusing. And then we got like 4 or 5 times as much feedback from the children, where they were really like thinking about it and like kind of constantly kind of questioning who this character was. And so from our perspective, we were like, you know what, we should just make the creatures really weird, because then the children will actually think about them. They'll be kind of questioning their roles in the environments instead of just taking them for granted. So this is sort of like, it felt like a really good indicator for us just to get really, really weird.
So this is the water stealer, and he lives in the reservoir, and when his water levels get really low, he goes to other environments, dives down, pierces the ground with his beak, sucks up the water, becomes really fat and slow, and takes that water back over and slowly fills up his reservoir.
So he's sort of an interferer, and so like when children see this happening, they'll like try and chase him before he's managed to fill himself up and steal their water. Here's some early sketches of the stoic bird, which is a funky little bird character that lives in the desert and then migrates to the plains to have babies. Here you can see us testing the stoic bird on the shifty cactus. And then another strange creature. This is the level 4 water deer that responds to the level 4 tree in the desert. And this is Emily and Josh testing the water deer at scale.
So as we were trying to make the creatures feel more responsive, we developed several different methods. The first one being a PNG sequence where we can denote different sections in an XML file, for example, eat or starting to run. But that got kind of tedious, so we made an editor where we can list the sections, view them, and also add, delete. And we can also add some velocity to the creature. So you can see he's walking, and if you just drag in this little timeline, he'll get a little bit of velocity, but it's very linear, and it felt very mechanical, and it didn't correspond to what the PNG sequence was doing. And so we added in a little curve editor to make a nonlinear velocity. That way it felt more natural, corresponded to what the PNG sequence was doing. So you can see he feels a little bit more like he's prancing.
It takes a little bit of work to dial it in, but when you dial it in, it feels really good to see the creature sort of moving forward, in kind of correspondence to the feet, the movement of the feet. This is the anti-pony, by the way. Of course. This is the early sketches of the wetlands level 4 creature, which is called the Wongu. He started off a little bit janky. Now he kind of developed to be a little nicer looking. And he responds to the level 4 plant in the wetlands, the shower plant. And when he's dirty, he can call out to the shower plant, and then you can trigger the shower plant to clean him. This was another sequence-based creature you saw a little bit earlier called the stork hugger, one of my favorite creatures. It's quite simply built, but what I really like about him is he will catapult himself from the different level 3 plants in the plains. And there's sort of a little bit of physics, so when he lands, it kind of causes the plants to sway, and children can reach up and touch them and cause them to jump across. We also started moving more towards dynamically controlled creatures, like this wetlands willow eater. Originally, this was just going to be a PNG sequence-based creature, but we wanted him to be able to eat fruit from the willow tree, and in order for him to do that, he had to kind of have an articulated head, and we just decided instead of kind of making him sequence-based and then trying to hack it just to build his whole body programmatically, and so his legs and his mouth can all kind of be controlled as a rigged creature.
This is the dream catcher, and you can see his design evolution here. And he's a combination of pre-rendered content and dynamically generated content. So you can see his legs are swaying and moving with his body as he moves around the scene.
And he was one of the earliest characters that we developed, but then we wanted to find a way to make him a bit more magical and ethereal. And we liked the idea of him kind of being a bit more like a constellation.
So this is the final version of him in the plains. He's drawn to the little particles swirling around the top of the level 4 plant there. And since we're generating his legs programmatically, we can target the moving pieces of food. And once he eats those little particles, he gains some color in his body.
And we really like kind of having this interaction between the level 4 plants in these environments and the creatures. And so it's sort of like an extra level of reward for the children if they manage to sustain these plants in this environment. One of the last approaches we took to animation was a hybrid approach, where it just made more sense to use PNG sequences for something like the walk cycle of the grazer, but then we can rig the body and the head so that the grazer is able to kind of eat things that are on the ground, and then also when you stick your hand out, they kind of investigate you. I kind of like to feel like they're worshipping you. It sort of feels like they are. And then you leave and they kind of look a little sad. This is the reservoir water blocker, some early sketches from him.
And he's composed of a mesh that is manipulating a PNG sequence that moves along a line. So if you agitate him, make him a little upset, he'll move out of his hole there, and he'll let some water flow down from the reservoir onto the floor. And once he cools down, calms down, he'll slither on back into his hole and block up the water from leaving. And so his eyes retract back into his body, and those happen to be flex shapes.
My favorite. And so, a lot of times, this hybrid approach is really like, Emily or, Josh will be like, this is how this guy works. And Nick and I are just like sitting there like, how the hell are we going to do this? And so the hybrid approach is really trying to get the character to do, what we want it to do in the most efficient way.
Then this is the caster bird. He's one of the more complicated. He uses most, if not all, of the methods. So he has a blink sequence, he has a pupil, which is an image controlled dynamically, a head sequence, a neck that's generated programmatically, a body that's a flex shape, and a tail sequence. So this allows him to land on the water in the reservoir, and he casts his head down into the water and eats the fish.
So working on this project, there were a couple of technical challenges that we were faced that really, made it almost feel like it was going to be impossible to solve. One of the biggest ones was working with all these different computers. We had something like 8 Mac Pros, one for each environment, and we had to kind of create this feeling that essentially it was just one seamless interactive space. And we solved this problem by developing this kind of amazing and sort of horrible solution that completely abuses the broadcast port of the router. And essentially, for people who don't know what the broadcast port is, it basically allows the Mac Pros to sort of shout all the things that are going on to the router, and then the router sends those messages to everyone. So we actually had to be very careful when we were on other people's networks and we were testing this, because every single machine, every laptop that was connected to the network would be getting this data. And so, if, for example, water was being sent from the floor to the planes, the planes machine would just listen to that data, even though there was data about lots of other events happening, like creature migration from, say, the desert to the mountain valley.
So the way we did creature migration was we took a few of the parameters that we needed to recreate the creature, such as speed, position. We put that into a buffer. We needed to zip that up because sometimes it was a little too large, turn that into a blob, send that over the broadcast, and then the corresponding machine would pull that blob in, unzip that, turn it into a buffer, and then turn that into the parameters that were used to recreate that creature. So in this above image, there's actually 2 of these rock and rollers that just are perfectly sitting on top of each other.
Fairly simple. And then here you can see the rock and rollers. They like to sit in the Mountain Valley River and block it, kind of their interferers. And here you can see them migrating from the Mountain Valley to the desert. And at that point that they cross over, they're actually kind of all that process that Nick just explained is happening. But it feels fairly seamless when it occurs. And then, of course, because they're interferers and they're kind of annoying, they get hot in the desert, and then they come right back and sit down in the mountain valley. These are really strange creatures. One of the other nice benefits to this ridiculous approach to networking is we essentially can sniff all this data from almost any device. And Nick created this amazing web interface that allows us actually to see the data that's going between all the machines in real time. We can actually see like how many creatures are in each environment, how many plants, which creatures are migrating to where. And because we have this ability, we have this separate installation called the global view, which gives kind of a bird's eye picture and is essentially monitoring this data and visualizing it in real time. And so here you can see the water that's being routed across the floor, and then the trees that are being planted in the different environments, and then the dead trees that are versus the live trees. And so this is actually going to be a core part of the installation that will actually be rendering a movie of people's experiences that they'll be able to then go sit back in the classroom and look over all this data to understand sort of why certain things might have happened. One of the other technical challenges we were faced with, and something that really felt insurmountable, was how do we track over such a big space of the floor? How do we make the floor interactive? It's a 68 by 48 foot space, and we were really kind of stumped for a long time. We looked at these very expensive time-of-flight 3D cameras. We also looked at plane-based LiDAR systems, which are incredibly expensive. And we thought we found a good solution with this radio-based system that would triangulate tags using fixed nodes. So we gave this a test. We set up these tags, and you can see here the tags are these little plastic blocks on the tops of the tripods. And we did some testing, and it actually seemed like it was going to work really well. You can see Nick and Emily working hard down here, playing with the water. But it felt really good. We thought this was going to be our solution. But what we found out was that when we actually try to do things at a much larger scale, here is sort of at the smaller scale, but when we try to do things at a much larger scale, where the tags would be where they would be in the connected worlds experience, the accuracy of the position got a lot worse. And as it was an alpha product at the time, we had to come up with another solution. And so we had this sort of kind of Hail Mary thing that we really didn't think was going to work, which was using retroreflective material and combining retroreflective fabric with an infrared camera lighting solution.
And we were really excited about the results because you can see how bright the logs and that T-shape is. So it became really easy to subtract that from the background.
Yeah, and it was sort of amazing. We didn't think it would work this well, and you could move stuff really far out to the sides, and it would still just show up really bright. And then the last kind of challenge that we faced was sort of how do we track the children interacting with the wall. And in the past, for projects like Funky Forest, we've used IR lights at the base of the wall and kind of done a background subtraction. But we didn't want to have all this lighting set up around the Great Hall space. So we got really excited about thermal video because we thought, okay, thermal, you can clearly see where children are. It worked really well for me when I was testing it on my own.
But we found that it was really problematic with heavy clothing or impressive amounts of hair, and you can see in the bottom right, my hand is completely black, which would make it very hard to track, and Theo has the nice glowing hands in the top left. So it looks like I have ice in my veins. This is a color version.
This isn't just some days, this is every day.
And my hands are most people's hands are as red as their faces, so it would be very hard to track these hands.
Yeah, and considering that we're trying to do hand tracking, we didn't want to be sort of tracking Nick's stumps like off his wrists or, So we kind of gave up on that. We got really excited when the Connect V2 came out. It was right around the time we were trying to figure this problem out. And so we did some tests in our office, and it looked really like it would work well. But then when we tested at a large scale, actually at the nervous system's office space, we noticed that the accuracy of the data really fell off at the edges. I mean, granted, we were pushing it way past the distance it was meant to be suitable for. But amazingly, the Connect version 1 can go way, way further. This is 24 feet distance from the Connect to the wall, covering about 24 feet wide, which is like triple the distance it's rated for. And so this seemed like it would be really promising. And we felt like with two Connects kind of positioned about 15, 16 feet up, we could probably cover the full width of one of the environments. So here you can see us just kind of confirming that it works at that height. And then we actually had to deal with a pretty interesting problem and something that has been quite a challenge, I think, for a lot of people. This image is actually borrowed from James George, so wherever you are, thanks, James. You can see in this image the problem of multiple perspectives. When you have two cameras that are looking at things from two different angles, at the point that you cross from one camera to the next, you get this kind of discontinuity. And here in the bottom, you can see that's actually one person in the middle there, but it looks like two separate bodies. And then this makes doing accurate hand tracking or interaction really, really tough. So we went back kind of to the office, and we really started thinking about ways to solve this multi-camera problem. Here you can see the issue again with the multiple perspectives. And this was sort of this moment where we had another crazy what-if approach, which was like maybe we could take the point clouds of these two Connects, combine them together into a single virtual space, get them aligned, and then actually look at them from a virtual camera where we could control the perspective of it and essentially just look at it from one space. And we didn't think this was going to work, but we gave it a try. And here you can see kind of trying to combine the two point clouds with the offset sliders until the stool becomes one. And then we tried walking between it, and as you can see, it looks almost perfect. As I move from one camera to the next, there's no change in perspective. And you can see a very faint line where you go from one point cloud to the next, but it seemed to work perfectly. We actually couldn't believe that this works. And then we tested it from above at the full height. And here you can see that orange area is the overlapping area where the two Connects are covering. And you get a little bit of extra noise, but it was totally usable for us once you do a little bit of filtering. So once we'd solved all these kind of big technical problems, we actually got to finally install this piece, and this was just a few months ago. This is what it looked like in February when we got there. They just put the walls in and the trussing for the projectors.
This is the space with nothing on. You can see the beautiful blue light shining in from the sun. And as Theo mentioned, it was February and the space was unheated. So someone built us this little heat hut, and we were wearing our full winter gear.
It was cold.
I had to go out and buy long johns. And it was very cold.
So this was this is us roughing it, programmer style, pushing changes from our heated makeshift hut to the installation. And then this was when we first got the projectors for the floor turned on, and here you can see the 7 projectors. You can kind of see the seams of the projection, which were kind of mapped and calibrated.
So this is the view from the 3 IR cameras from above, looking down at the logs on the floor. And one of the biggest challenges was taking those camera space, mapping it into the projected space on the floor. So we came up with this calibration system where we projected a point, we would put a log there, capture that point. Once we got enough points, we would calculate homography matrix, then we would use that to translate the camera coordinates into the floor coordinates so that the physical logs would influence the digitally projected water.
Honestly, we didn't think it was going to work, and I remembered I was waiting for our baby to arrive, and Nick called me up, and he's like, "It works." He's like, "I can't believe it works." And the quick rough calibration that he did the first time he was down there, we haven't changed it. It's still that same calibration, and it's rock solid. You can see here the kind of outlines being drawn around the shapes as seen by the camera. So we really, it's terrible to say that you make a project and you think everything's not going to work and you're surprised when it does, but I feel okay saying that about this project. So after we got the kind of floor aligned and calibrated, we had to do the same thing for the walls. The walls are all continuous curves, no straight surfaces, so they had to be warped.
So this is the plains wall. It's the most curved wall in the entire exhibition. And you can see without any correction, it's all over the floor, it's all over the walls. And this is the image we have to project onto the wall so that it looks correctly mapped. And here's the final version. And then
another really complicated thing was the fact that we also had to deal with the tracking on a curved wall. And so it made the kind of process of aligning these 2 point clouds a lot harder because we had 2 connects that were kind of looking at the walls from very different angles. So we had to add a rotate slider to both connects, and you can see me slowly kind of trying to rotate these 2 point clouds into a single space. And once we had that, then we had another problem, which was that all of our geometry was relative to a curved wall. So we had to add an unwarp slider as well to the point cloud to make it seem from the system's perspective that the person, when they move their hand along, is basically doing it along a straight surface. It was much easier to do this than to try and rewrite all of our hand tracking and gesture code to account for like a radial movement. So with all that stuff, with all the connects working and calibrated, then we did some tests of the interaction. Testing planting seeds with your hand, testing chopping down the dead trees, which feels really satisfying. And children love to chop down the dead trees. And then also the damming of the water.
So here Theo is putting a log in front of the Mountain Valley River, and when he moves it away, you can see that parts of the river become unblocked. And he'll move it back there, almost covering it, and then the water will stop.
And then also trying to break the floor tracking system. I don't know why Nick built this thing. I don't really understand.
This is me trying to... I'm just casually trying to exceed the max blob size.
I think he was just a bit tired and wanted to lie down. You can see the same shot from above with all those logs. You can see sort of how bright the retroreflective material is. We were also testing pooling water, seeing like if we could make the system crash by capturing all the water into one place. And then here you can see the floor from above, the water bouncing off of all of the logs. And it actually becomes very challenging trying to control this water over such a large space, because you're literally you're seeing some water about to go off the edge, and you're just running after it. And we saw kids diving, throwing logs out in front of them just to kind of catch this last drop of water.
This is an example of flooding. So when the water table exceeds its limit, it spills out onto the floor, and you can take that water out by putting a log in that flooded area, and it will pipe the water out in the direction of the log.
So after we'd done all this playtesting ourselves, it was really kind of nerve-wracking and exciting to invite children to come in. And this was just been the last couple of weeks. We basically finished this project, almost completely finished it a few days ago. So we had children come in. It was amazing to see them immediately just running in and making trees in the different environments. We had teenagers as old as 15 or 16 playing with it, and we were really happy to see that they enjoyed the connected worlds. And also, we had very small children, much younger children come in, and we were very excited to see the hand tracking working with these very small kids, as well as kind of way too many kids in one environment, and the system sort of somehow still working well. We have one more thing to show you, and that's just a little video, quick kind of preview of Connected Worlds at the Hall of Science. I just want to say huge thanks to Dave, to Jer, to Kathleen and Wes for inviting us out here, and we're really excited to share this with everyone at Eyeo. So thank you very much. Thanks.